My name is Saru, and I founded and direct a national restaurant workers organization called Rock United. We started the organization just after September 11th. There was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower 1, called Windows on the World, and about 73 workers died that morning inside the restaurant. They were literally from all walks of life, all over the world, including America, and most of them, almost all of them, were people of color. And about 250 workers lost their jobs that morning in the restaurant. About 13,000 restaurant workers lost their jobs in the months and weeks following the tragedy. So right after the tragedy, I was invited by the union that was inside that restaurant. At that time, it was HRE Local 100, later merged into Unite Here, to start an organization that would initially provide support to all the displaced workers all over New York City, and then the families of the victims. But what started as just a tiny little support center post 9/11 has grown into a national organization. We now have 10,000 restaurant worker members in 18 cities across the United States. And I'm going to tell you a lot more about it before introducing Chuck, but just to say kind of a lot of the comments in the room have been sort of where are the affected people. I just wanted to say that my organization is one that is led by restaurant workers themselves, from the board to the directors to the staff are all former restaurant workers except for me. We, have grown our work nationally by lifting up the voices of these workers and really understanding what's going on in this extraordinary industry. That film that you just saw was actually created by a restaurant worker who also happens to be a really amazing videographer, and he came up with the whole thing himself, designed it, and when I show it, every time I speak, people, well, what struck you? It's a small enough group. What struck you? Anything in particular strike you? Absolutely. So, definitely, cost of food and wages. Yep, a very pervasive practice in low-wage sectors. In fact, the U.S. Department of Labor says the restaurant industry is their #1 source of complaints about what's called wage theft, which is the theft of wages.
I was struck by the vulnerability of these folks, that they can't, there's no place that they can complain, and they wouldn't be able to anyway, perhaps because of the situation and all that. So it's vulnerability.
There is a place they can complain, but yes, they're very vulnerable. Yes.
I was struck by how expensive the restaurant bill was, and I was sort of wondering if we have other videos that are not in, that illustrate the issue for non-high-end restaurants. And kind of wondering who the audience is for this particular video that you had in mind.
Okay, I can get to that. No, he gets tips too, but he gets far less than tips. I'm surprised nobody, no health insurance for sure. So I'm just sorry, I have only 10 minutes. I'm going to talk quickly, but given this crowd, I'm surprised nobody mentioned the racial dynamics in the restaurant, which is it's very representative of the restaurant industry in the United States, which is that what we call the front of the house, the people who serve your food, particularly in fine dining restaurants, are almost all white workers. The people of color are generally, the further back you go, the darker the skin is, especially in a city like Miami, where we've done a ton of research and found that literally the farther back you go into the restaurant, all the way back to the Haitian dishwashers, the darker the skin color gets. So extreme occupational segregation in our industry. I just wanted to share some data about this industry real quick before telling you about what we do. So the restaurant industry right now is neck and neck with retail as the largest and fastest growing sectors of the U.S. economy. It's over 10 million employees nationwide. 1 in 10 Americans works in the restaurant industry. Let me say that again. 1 in 10 Americans in the United States works in the restaurant industry. I've heard a lot of talk, and I'm sorry for the noise, the baby noise. I've heard as much as I could given the baby. Of the conversations, heard a lot of talk about, obviously asset creation and wealth creation. But what we have here is the largest private sector employer in the United States, proliferating the lowest paying jobs in the U.S. So not only is it the largest and fastest growing sector of the U.S. In terms of employers, it also happens to be the employer of 7 of the 10 lowest paying jobs in America. So the absolute two lowest paying jobs in America, lower than farm worker jobs, lower than every other occupation, are dishwashers and fast food cooks and preps. And those are the people who cook, prepare, and serve our food, and they, in vast majority, live in poverty, let alone having access to any kind of capital. So you can see the darker line is actually restaurant industry growth over the last 20 or so years, and the bottom line is all private sector growth. It's a dramatic increase in restaurant jobs compared to every other sector of the economy. It also has the largest concentration of minimum wage workers of any sector of the U.S. So again, largest sector of the economy, but paying the lowest paying jobs. And this is not an accident, and not because of the structure of this industry. The industry likes to say, oh, this is a very low profit margin industry, and that's why this happens. In fact, the truth is that back in 1996, a dear friend named Herman Cain, when he was the head of the National Restaurant Association, struck a deal with the Democrats in Congress to say that we, the National Restaurant Association, will not oppose the overall minimum wage continuing to rise as long as the minimum wage for tipped workers stays frozen forever. And apart from those of you that have been in the room with me, what's the tip minimum wage right now at the federal level?
$2.13.
You guys know me too well. $2.13 it's been stuck at for the last 21 years. And that means that for us, that we have members across the country who are homeless, and you've got to change your notion of what you think of as homeless. These are working homeless. These are people who are living paycheck to paycheck, sometimes can't afford the rent, sometimes can't, sometimes living in their car. And the problem is very much exacerbated for people of color and for women. So poverty rates, although servers themselves, servers as a category, meaning waiters and waitresses in America, have 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce. Poverty rates are much higher for servers of color even than for all servers. So you can see, whereas 14% of all servers in America, or white servers, live in poverty, 22% of black servers live in poverty. And what is the lifelong impact of this inequity, both in terms of race and gender? Because 70% of workers who earn tips in America are women. Well, you can see black women in particular, black women bartenders lose $620,000 over a lifetime because of race and gender gaps. Latino women lose almost $400,000. So if we are not looking at wages and income, we are losing an enormous source of wealth. Can I say that again? If we are not looking at wages and income, we are losing what could be a home purchasing ability, right? And so what is the root of this? The root of this disparity is highly observable occupational segregation. We actually sent in pairs of people of color and white applicants into fine dining restaurants, 200 pairs in New York, Chicago, Detroit, and New Orleans. We did a 4-city study, and we did what's called match pairs audit testing and canvassing. And the blue line is white, and these are fine dining restaurants in New York City. You can see that by vast majority, fine dining restaurants in New York City wait staff are white. And so what does that mean? Workers of color work in lower level segments, fast food, casual restaurants. They also work in lower level occupations like bussers, runners, dishwashers, and cooks. Again, this is the largest industry in America, neck and neck with retail, and so we can't ignore these issues. So our model in addressing these things, I think you can think about the solution to inequity, wage inequity, and this gap of $620,000 in 2 ways. You could think about fighting the inequity itself, so fighting against discrimination in the workplace. But 2, you could also think about raising the floor. Because if you've got 10 million workers, and our estimate is that about 20% of these jobs are livable wage jobs, you're never going to fit 10 million workers in 2 million jobs. Do you understand what I'm saying? You can fight inequity and discrimination and occupational segregation, but you also have to think about lifting the floor for the 10 million workers, because 10 million workers are never going to fit in 2 million jobs. And so the interesting thing is when you actually lift the floor, if you were to raise the tip minimum wage to from $2.13 to $5, which is our proposal right now in Congress, you could actually not only double wages for about 29 million workers in America, not just restaurant workers, you could also actually reduce the gap. And I know that doesn't make sense, perhaps intuitively, but when you raise the bottom, because workers are making so little, you actually reduce the disparity. So you have to think about it in 2 ways. Fighting the inequity itself, which we do, and raising the floor. So the way that we do it is we have 3 prongs. We create consequences for low road actors. What does that mean? We've waged campaigns, organizing and litigation campaigns. I'm an attorney, one of the hats that I play. And we have won now 13 campaigns against high-profile restaurant companies where we've won a total of $7 million in stolen tips and wages and discrimination payments. And we've won promotions for people of color and new promotions practices for people of color and women. We've won grievance procedures, job security, we've raised wages, we've won benefits like paid sick days and health insurance for thousands of workers in these 13 high-profile restaurant companies. One example, we just won a company against a guy named Mario Batali. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a celebrity chef. There we won $1 million in stolen tips and wages and discrimination payments. We got rid of a racist chef, and we moved a bunch of workers of color into wait staff positions. Secondly, we do what's called promoting the high road to profitability. There we've actually organized employers. We've organized responsible restaurant owners that are trying to do the right thing, providing good wages and good opportunities for their employees. We've got about 100 of these restaurant owners around the country. We've worked with them and Cornell University to do a series of studies that actually show that raising wages and providing benefits reduce turnover, increase profitability, and increase productivity among workers. So we are thinking about this collective prosperity or shared prosperity model that people have been talking about and actually proving quantitatively that raising wages increases profitability and productivity and reduces turnover in the long run. We've also taken them with us to Congress to say, I'm an owner, but I believe in promotion opportunities for workers of color. We took Tom Colicchio's staff. You may have heard of him. He's the star of Top Chef. We took him to Congress, and he said in the New York Times, I actually believe in promoting workers of color from within. I see it does better. It helps my business do better. Also part of promoting the high road to opportunity has been opening our own worker-owned restaurant. So the restaurant that video was filmed in is our own restaurant called Colors in New York. We have a second restaurant called Colors in Detroit. We're opening a third Colors in New Orleans. These restaurants not only are open to the public, but they actually are training spaces. We train about 1,000 low-wage workers of color a year to move up to these livable wage jobs in the industry. And we've actually partnered with community colleges around the country to get them college credit for these training programs that they go through. The last piece of our work is that we do research and policy work. I'm an academic. I teach at UC Berkeley, but also we partner with academics around the country, and we've put out about 20 reports. We've surveyed at this point, about 6,000 restaurant workers around the country. We've done match pairs audit testing studies. We've done NIH-funded ergonomic studies. We've done a lot of research. It's been the basis for local, state, and federal policy work. At the federal level, and we've won several bills. We won a raise in tip minimum wage in New York State from $3 to $5. In Philadelphia, we just won a bill that makes it illegal to deduct credit card processing fees from workers' tips, which, by the way, is legal everywhere else. So you should not leave your tips on credit cards. At the federal level, we've been working for the last 5 years to increase that ridiculously low minimum wage of $2.13 for the last several years. First, we got Congresswoman Donna Edwards. Some of you may know her. She's wonderful from Maryland. She's a former restaurant worker. She introduced a bill called the Wages Act that would increase the tip minimum wage to 70% of the regular, so overcoming the legacy of Herman Cain and finally relinking the tip minimum wage to the regular minimum wage. Our big victory this year was getting Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate to wholly subsume her bill, basically our proposal to raise the tip minimum wage. So George Miller in the House and Senator Harkin in the Senate introduced a comprehensive Fair Minimum Wage Act, which we really actually do see movement in, and we think we might be able to move in the next couple of years, that wholly subsumes this proposal to raise the tip minimum wage. Now, when he introduced the bill, George Miller, he said to us, to overcome the power of the National Restaurant Association, which, by the way, is all the Fortune 500 restaurant companies, McDonald's, Olive Garden, Red Lobster, Applebee's, we're going to have to see a groundswell in America. And so we thought about that. How can we build a groundswell in America? And so for the last year and going into the next several years, we've built out a multi-pronged, multimedia consumer engagement campaign that is all about, to answer your question, targeting the food movement and people who consider themselves to be foodies. And the reason why that's important is that that movement, for those of you that may know, has really exploded over the last several years. There's been a book called Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser and a book called Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan. Really exploded. Food is big right now. Several 100,000 people go to these food conferences. I just came back from Italy, the International Slow Food Conference. There was about 250,000 people there. It's really become a huge, very popular issue among lots of people. And so capitalizing on that, we did a couple of things. First, we created an alliance of worker organizations throughout the food system called the Food Chain Workers Alliance. We ended up putting out a report together with my research center at UC Berkeley called A Dime a Day that shows that actually raising the minimum wage as we've proposed it in the Fair Minimum Wage Act would only increase the cost of food, both in the grocery stores and in restaurants, by about a dime a day for the average American household over the next 3 years, about $30 in 3 years. We also have put out a national diners guide, which you may have seen. Tomorrow, actually, an iPhone app, a smartphone app is coming out. This guide, we put out our app tomorrow. The guide and the app basically show the minimum wage, paid sick days, and internal mobility, promotions practices of the 150 most popular restaurants in America. So the New York Times wrote about the guide, and on the day they did, 60,000 people visited our website to get the guide. And so we are really building a popular movement. That video, by the way, has gotten 110,000 views on YouTube. So we're really working at growing this groundswell. The next step was writing our own book because we saw the popularity of Fast Food Nation, Omnivore's Dilemma. We wrote a book called Behind the Kitchen Door, which is coming out on 2013, February 13th, to highlight the minimum wage being $2.13. Eric Schlosser has written the foreword, and Danny Glover has made a series of short films based on the workers profiled in the book, and he's making a full-length fiction feature film through his production company, Louverture Films, on the story of Rock, and myself and my co-founder that's coming out in 2014. We're also building out a new consumer organization, a foodie organization, working in partnership with food organizations around the country to really be a new voice of advocacy among consumers, food consumers, and take it back to George Miller and say, look, we've built a groundswell. We are consumers. We care about these issues, right? So I've been talking as fast as I could to get to the main point, which is I'm tired too. But I'm excited. I'm so excited. And let me tell you why I'm so excited. I'm so excited to be here with you. I'm so excited and thankful and grateful to Anand and Anne for bringing up income as a part of this conversation. I'm so eternally grateful for that because I've been a part of these conversations for the last couple of years. I think I was invited initially because colors and cooperatives have been seen as a source of wealth generation. But I want to say from the bottom of my heart, income is a source of wealth generation too, and we cannot forget it. And of course, we completely understand, I think Chuck and I completely agree that by itself, it's not going to close the racial wealth gap. But without it, we're not going to close the racial wealth gap. And so we have to look at income disparities, and we have to think about workers are not only increasing their incomes, but not having to lose their jobs because of lack of paid sick days or lack of health insurance, having a union contract because it will both increase their income and their job security that will ultimately allow them to buy a home or get an education, right? And so we're not thinking of it as a zero-sum game. Don't think that we're saying increase the minimum wage or support unions in place of supporting home ownership. We need to think of it as a package of policies that ultimately help people of color move up the ladder to better job security, better incomes. And while in doing that, we cannot forget these huge sectors of the economy like the restaurant industry where perhaps we're thinking about high-tech and healthcare and home ownership, but I tell you the people on the ground, this is the industry they're gravitating towards. When they lose their job in the factory or anywhere else, they are headed to the restaurant industry. I know because our doors are flooded constantly with laid-off workers from other sectors, from finance to auto, seeking training in the restaurant industry. Believe it or not. So it's a plea for us to include income and jobs in this conversation. And who better to do that than Chuck Rocha, who's here from Solidarity Strategies. Did I get that right? Solidarity Strategies, which is one of the only people of color led and owned political strategy groups in Washington, D.C. And it's a real honor to be on the stage with him because Chuck is also comes from 20 years in the labor movement, was the national political director for the United Steelworkers, a really great union, and has held a lot of other positions in the labor movement. So let's give a big round of applause to Chuck.
So that was amazing. I learned a lot. I know you probably learned a lot. And we probably won't look at restaurants in the same way. Now, I'll stop right there because a lot of folks have been sitting and watching me here for a day and a half, and they were like, is that really how that boy talks? Right. I was invited to a conference of color, but we end up inviting the only Latino in America that talks like a redneck. Here we go. Sorry, it's what you get. Closing the racial wealth gap. We can't wait. So let's think about this. I've been in labor for 24 years. I left labor, never really left, but I quit the union 3 years ago on a whim and prayer because I was aggravated. I was not only aggravated at the racial wealth gap, I was tired of waiting. I was tired of waiting for political consultants and the people who run the political industry to look like the people they were trying to go get to vote. So I did something I knew nothing about, and I started a business. I started a business which is the only Latino-owned political consulting firm in D.C. that just does politics. One of the only minority-owned firms. When we would sit around in these powerful meetings, I will tell some true stories and speak truth to word. And that is that I would be the only person of color sitting in these powerful political meetings. I was the only Latino political director of all the unions. I was one of the only minorities of all the unions. We have to look within a lot of times to fix some of the external problems. And that's what created solidarity strategies. I take it very personally about what we're talking about with low-wage workers and workers in general. We are all workers at certain degrees. But I will say this first and foremost, that I don't come from your world, and I apologize in advance. I don't apologize for who I am or where I come from. I just come at it from a different angle. I have aspired my whole life to be people like you, to be someone of academics, somebody of immense knowledge on policy. And it's sometimes hard for me to even say those words because I couldn't spell those words when I got out of high school. I was a really good football player when I was in high school. I was 75 pounds heavier than I am right now, and I was an all-state lineman in Texas. And I thought at that time I was the biggest brown redneck you've ever seen, and I was mean. Mean. And I was good at what I did, but because of that, they put me through school. And I graduated high school, and I could barely read and write. And and that's a story told across a lot of rural America. Let's talk about this before I take up all of my time, because I was sitting back here the whole time talking to Roberto like, what are we doing here and what am I going to say? He said, say what we talk about every day, and so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you two stories. I'm going to start with two stories. Two stories about two young men, two young minority men, talking about low-wage earners and prosperity in our community and things that we can do to fix these gaps, which are a combination in a package, like the sister said. There was this young woman in East Texas, young woman, 15 years old, met the man of her dreams in a Baptist church. The man of her dreams was a young, strapping Latino boy. His family had just moved to East Texas. She was a white girl that looked Latino, dark hair, dark eyes. Her grandmother had passed away on an Indian reservation in Oklahoma. They fell in love, and like most young couples back in the late 60s, they had a small child. And they stayed together. He got a job at the local factory. They bought their first car. They lived in a trailer house next to the girl's mom and daddy on their little farm. They had a little 30-acre farm. The boy's raised in East Texas. The Latino father ends up divorcing the mother, leaves the home. The mother stays, gets several jobs, many of them wrapping meat at night, doing hair, and working in a restaurant. But the grandmother and the extended family's there to help with that child. There's another child involved as well. He has a little sister. And they're raised in this small East Texas community, 18 miles from the nearest city. Now, growing up, there's no internet at that time. And the disparaging thing is there's still no internet on that hill today for those people in that community. He did his homework with an encyclopedia, went on to high school, graduated high school, and ironically enough, went to work in that same factory where his father worked. Now, while in that factory, this boy, this Latino boy, who barely gets out of high school, goes to work in a factory. Nobody in this family has ever been to college in their entire life. No one. Absolutely no one. And this boy is destined to follow the path of every young man in that community. I would say even void of race. But people who were black and brown in that community, you knew that where they were going to work. They were going to be on construction sites. They were going to back into those restaurants. Or they may be lucky enough to go to work in this factory. Well, in this factory, there's a union. And in this factory, this 19-year-old boy who goes to work in that factory gets set up on a machine working next to a man who he played football with that man's son. That man had been on that job for 15 years. That man standing next to him on that job made $22 an hour, had full benefits, health care, and a pension. A pension and a 401k that the company matched 50 cents on the dollar. When that 19-year-old boy stood in next to that machine, next to that full-grown man, that 19-year-old boy was making the same amount of money as the man sitting next to him because he was doing the same job. That's the difference of what a union worker does and what a non-union worker does. That's why the unions have been so powerful in building the middle class. And as most of you know, that boy is me. That was my 15-year-old mother. That was my story. I got involved in the union with no education, not knowing anything. At one point, not even knowing I was brown or who I belonged to or who my race was. I was raised by an old white man from Kentucky who had a farm where I hauled hay and chopped wood, where I had my first gun when I was 8, when I went to a Baptist church, got saved when I was 9 and baptized when I was 12. You don't forget those times in your life. And was fortunate enough to become a union steward. I'll never forget the guy who come up and said, Chuck, you need to be union steward on the back shift. We put up the sign, but nobody signed up because you're all a bunch of kids. He's like, you would be perfect. I'm like, why would I be perfect? Sam, you know me. I barely got out of high school. How am I going to enforce a union contract? He said, well, the white people will vote for you because you talk like them, and the black people vote for you because you look like them. He said, you should do this. I said, Sam, you know, I got to load the machine. And every 45 seconds, that belt moves up, and I got to throw them bales of rubber on there, and they pay me $21 an hour. I got a brand new pickup truck, and I'm chasing girls all weekend long. My life is good. I don't need no more headaches. I've hit the top. He said, Chuck, and this one sentence changed my life forever. He said, Chuck, he said, if you need to do union work or represent workers, we'll get somebody else to load the machine. I said, just sign me up. An activist was born that day. Now, who would know that 8 years later, from getting involved in the local Democratic Party and getting to go out and do campaigns, being kind of quick on my feet, that the United Steelworkers would make me their national political director when I was 29 years old? That's closing the gap. I was destined not to have that job. Everything about my life and how I was raised said I should not be in that position. And then I'm here before you now. Most of you have spent more time in a classroom than I've spent even thinking about a classroom, right? And I admire that. I said that in the beginning. That was my precursor. But this is the story of America. This is the story of unions. The only key piece of that piece that you should think about is the day I hired into that plant. And I got the job. I swear to God, his name was Homer. Homer Kofer, okay? African-American brother. His son was a year younger than me and played tight end. Huge black man I worked next to, right? Same job, same money, right? There was no prejudice. They didn't care because that's what the contract said, and they had to do it. I went on to become a union steward. I'm going to say this, and this is the last story about that story. Smalls. I remember Smalls. Smalls was having trouble at home. Smalls' wife was leaving him. Smalls started coming to work drunk on the back shifts. We'd clock in at 11 o'clock at night. Smalls was drunk when he got there. Now, because he was having trouble and his wife was leaving him. We all knew that. But then he started showing up late, and then he started getting grievances, right? Because the company wanted to punish him. So they wrote him up, because this was the grievance procedure. And then they gave him 3 days off. There was a write-up in between. At the end of the day, Smalls had gotten all the way to a 30-day dismissal. But after 30 days, they brought him back again, because the last step was 60, and then he was gone. But we went through 8 steps of a grievance that I was representing him on. Now, I got Smalls back. We put him in treatment. He found a new girlfriend. His life got better. And Smalls worked in that plant from then on. But if Smalls hadn't had a contract, because he was going through a devastating thing in his life, he would have not had any way to take care of his children. That's story A of the rural Mexican. Story B starts in San Diego. It starts in San Diego with a beautiful woman having a brand new little Mexican baby, but in San Diego. And there comes another small baby, a little sister. And because it's easier or more affordable to raise those babies in Tijuana, she takes her children and moves to their little house in Tijuana, Mexico. Now, both of these children have been born in America, but they made a calculated risk to say, we can do more for our children if we live in Mexico. So they took that moderate income of $30,000 a year, and they used that money to make sure that these children get the one thing that is the all-time equalizer to all people of color, which all of you remarkably have, which is an education. So she pays for it. They pay for it. These children to go to private Catholic schools in America. So every single day, she gets up or has other people get up, and there's a commuter where these children cross the border every single day to go to school, sacrificing their own self for the betterment of their children. Then that child graduates, goes off to college in San Diego, has to get school loans to go to college because they made $30,000 a year. But they were doing what they were told. We tell our children, go to school at all costs because this is the great equalizer and we can't wait, and closing a wealth gap. Then they say, you can go to grad school. You have to take out more loans to go to grad school. And he does that. $150,000 later in debt and looking for a job. $150,000 later. Playing by the rules, doing what they're told, making good grades, but incurring this debt. Gets involved in all the things that they're supposed to be involved in, from schools to extracurricular. Luckily enough, this boy ends up getting a fellowship with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, where he meets a loudmouth, crazy redneck political director of the unions. And this boy's name is Roberto Fierro, and he's the vice president of Solidarity Strategy, sitting in the front row. And he's the one who's always saying, first of all, let's talk about how smart I am. The first thing you got to know is, my granddaddy said, you got to know what you know and know what you don't know. And what I didn't know was in books, right? So who do you hire to be the vice president of the firm? Somebody in those books, right? The smart one. I ain't no fool. I would stack the hay just high enough. I needed somebody to tell me the easier way to stack the hay, right? So Roberto's like, how are other people like me supposed to have the opportunity? There are lots of Latino kids. And let's not mention if they're dark Latino kids like me and him, right? There are certain prejudices within our own cultures. But if I'm supposed to go to school and do what's right and make my grades, what's going to happen to $150,000 worth of loans that I have? What happens to the work that I could, if I hadn't hired him, he would be teaching school like he was in San Diego, making a paltry wage with all of that education. Where if he was white, would that story be different? Maybe. I can tell you in our world that we work in every day, that's in the political world, is that it is different. It's hard for two brown boys to break into the power to be in the things that they do in Washington, because everybody, some of our own institutions, not laying blame on anyone in the room, has their group of their guys. And most of them are white because they've been doing it for a long time, and it's hard for somebody young to break in. And I ain't young no more. Think about that young brother, that young sister coming up who is sharp and gets it, but they just don't know the right people. This is the key element of what we need to fix. Everything that we've talked about here is all tied to one thing, to public policy and politics. It is astounding to me that there are women and children who go to work every day in the back end of a restaurant, or for that matter in the front end busting that table, who make $2.13. And the only reason it's that way because a lawmaker passed that law to say it's supposed to be that way. All that me and Roberto do is kick butt every single day. People hire us to go get somebody. It used to be back in the day when I was taking care of the local union, and my job was to take care of the president. Back then, in the old school days, when I weighed 300 pounds. When I was meaner than a junkyard dog. When he went out, I was with him. You go get him. If there's this politician or that politician, they want to stand in the way of people of color, we have got to go get him. We have to go get her, and we need to replace them. Not do harm to them, just simply replace them. For the first time in American history, and I've been doing politics for 26 years now, the minority communities, black, brown, women, all different ethnic backgrounds, American Indians, Asians, we are the majority now. The reason the Romney turnout model was wrong is because he undercompensated the minority vote. Now, this is the part of the geek world that I love, right? This is the only number of programs that I study or even know how to read, is I know politics, and I know how to run campaigns. I ran 2 presidential races. I know when you're out in the field what's going to happen, but it's still a guess. You guess a model on a poll based off of what you think a predetermined turnout ratio will be based off of demographics and data and models. And Romney to this day, and you think that that's a made-up story, they knew they were going to win. Their numbers said they were going to win. But they had underestimated that black people and brown people would turn out at the way that they would turn out. They had no idea that African Americans would come back at the same energy rate, or that Latinos would really show up 2 or 3 points more than what they thought. They knew they were going to lose them 70-30, but they just thought that the turnout number wouldn't be as high. We have a real moment in time to capture if we really don't want to wait. If we really want to close the gap, we can sit here and you can talk to yourself and sound smart because, by God, you are. There is no doubt about that. And we can talk ourselves into the ground, or we can get up and we can do something. Now, what we got to get up and we got to go do is get somebody's attention on Capitol Hill or in a state legislature. I'm currently writing a book about the Latino vote. And me and Roberto left today at lunch, and we went and interviewed the vice mayor of a small city in Broward County, right? He's the youngest elected Latino there. He's an elected Latino Jew. Stay with me. This is great. He's 31 years old. He's been elected since he was 29. And when I asked him what his passion was, of what he thinks about Latinos and minority voting, he talked about people. And he talked about helping people. And I've known this cat for 3 or 4 years. I didn't even know he'd gotten elected. Let me get straight there, right? He saw some Facebook picture of me running down the beach a couple days ago. He was like, "Are you in Miami? You should give me a holler." I was like, "Sure, you buying a beer, I'll be there." Little did I know he'd got elected, right? But I say that to say from that level, if you took that vice mayor, this project of what goes on in the restaurants, and we educated them and talked about why our communities of color are disproportionately affected by every government policy and everything that happens within our own government that we're supposed to control, what we're supposed to have the vote over, then we make real change. Then you really put people in there. Maybe we can elect a black president. Whew, who would have thought that, right? Let's get crazy up in here. That shit happened. I don't know if y'all remember. If we can do that, we can do lots of things. But we underestimate our political power, right? Because the craziest thing to be in D.C. right now is ain't but 2 kinds of people in D.C. Those who are Latino and those that are lying about being Latino. They're like, "Oh, yeah, I'm Latino. I was the one working on that Obama race. I'm responsible for all that." Because they think they're going to make money off of it now. I mean, that's just how it is. But it ain't about making money. I can sit here and grab about the same old groups, hiring the same old white consultants, and woe is me and Roberto, the poor little Mexican firm, not making it, right? That ain't what this is about. This is about change. And this is about colors that make change. Politicians only care about 2 things. They care about money and they care about votes. And if they're worried they're going to get voted out, they'll do what they got to do. This election was a wake-up call for all of us who really can't wait and want to see that. For you old gray hairs in here, y'all been talking about this for a long time, and I mean no disrespect. But back then, there wasn't as many of us. Now there's a lot more of us, and we come in every shade. And by God, we come in every accent. And when we all work together, and it's so generalized, and Roberto will get on my ass about that, but he's going to say, you should tell them exactly what we're going to do and when we're going to do it and what the strategic plan is. No, that's what we have to figure out. Everything that you've said, you're the most integral part of it because you have the plans and know how it can happen. You know the direct policy that needs to be enacted to make equity benefits economically to lots of people. Where all you've got to do is hire somebody like me and Roberto or somebody who knows what they're doing to help mobilize this group of people in a modern world to say, we're going to stand up and we're going to be heard. A long time ago, a little old lady said, "I ain't giving up my seat." And people talk about that story over and over again. We talk about Cesar Chavez and the greats. We all have these great stories of great pioneers amongst all of our cultures. But it's those legacies that we have to have together. We have to join the legacies of Cesar and Dr. Martin Luther King. We have to bring those communities together and say there's one thing that we've all been talking about, and it's the name of this conference, which is how do we close that gap? How do we not no more have to be a special sector of the electorate, but become part of the majority of the electorate? Because at that point, they got to listen to us.
They had to put more people in power who looked and act like us. And once they get there and they put them all in safe seats, they put all the black folks in this seat, all the Latinos in this seat, all the unions and all the people go, oh, those are in safe seats, we're not going to give them no money. Corporate America comes in and goes, all right, brother, here we go. Here's you a check, and here's you a check. We need to make sure we keep that minimum wage at $2.13 over here. We need to make sure that you're doing this with the interest rates for credit cards for poor people over here. And while all the rest of us are focused on 55 races that are marginal, not those safe black seats and those safe brown seats. And now those safe gay seats and those safe Asian seats. We just keep multiplying. What do we do in the next conference when we put a strategic plan together to say that our country is a country of many colors, and the colors are coming to watch you? The colors are coming to see how you're going to vote. We know you've been good. We know you've been okay. Some of you okay, some of you good, and we're going to work on you. To make sure that we have the progressive voice to say that there is a real wealth gap. And then we put them in a room with somebody like y'all, not with me, somebody like y'all, who says, look, here are the policies that you have been walking away from. That helps not only people of color, but it helps America as a whole. We all come here one way or the other. We all own this place now. It's part of our place. Whether you grew up in a trailer house with a 15-year-old mother or you grew up in Mexico, it's our place. And then how do we make that voice be heard? It just does me, and let me close with this. It does me really good to know that when we do get them elected, and we're going to open it up for questions, and when we do put people in power, that there are good academic scholars and people of color and of every gender that can fill up this room who can say, I know exactly what we need to be doing, and that you just haven't been willing to give us a shot to enact it. Thank you very much.
I hope you understand why I had to bring these two people here today. Because these two people are trying to change the world. And Saru, thank you. I've been so pleased to just work a little bit with Saru and plan to work more with Saru. But if you listen to what she laid out a comprehensive strategy that will change the incomes of millions of Americans. From research, and her research is tight, okay? Her work on discrimination and pairing, impeccable. National policy agenda in Congress. Groundswell from workers. Engaging ordinary citizens. These are all components of a comprehensive strategy to make transformative change. And that's why I had to bring her in front of you today. And Chuck is just Chuck. So I want to open up the floor for questions and answers. I did email a few of you to say, do you want to be respondents? I think Algernon said yes for sure. Wilhelmina and Roy. Jim. So let's start with Algernon, and then we'll just pass the mic this way. We'll get you to Sandy, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the audience. Algernon.
Okay, great. Great presentations. Again, I'm Algernon Austin with the Economic Policy Institute. Great presentations on many fronts. I think you both raised really important issues. One, the extremely low rate for the tipped minimum wage and the importance of unions. And I think it's really essential that we really think of this as part of the components of wealth creation, right? One point that I like to make, stepping back one step behind what you raised, was jobs. If you don't have a job, you're not going to build wealth. You're going to go into debt. You're going to spend down your savings. And part of the reason we've seen such a tremendous loss of wealth with the Great Recession is because there's been a tremendously high rate of unemployment. So we have to keep in mind a jobs agenda and a national jobs agenda as a crucial part of creating wealth. And it's also important because when we have a strong, robust job creation, we have tight labor markets. And tight labor markets also put upward pressure on wages. So that's another mechanism by which we improve the wages of low-income people, and we give them the opportunity to increase their savings and to purchase assets. So that's really important. It also strengthens the bargaining position of unions when labor markets are tight. So that's really crucial. So we have to think, relating to all of that, we have to think of two things. One, we've seen over the last 40 years increasing economic inequality. So we've seen the wages at the bottom have been stuck, like for servers. But more generally, the minimum wage still continues to be at a historically low rate. It's still below where it was in 1968. And we can do a lot better than that. So we have to push for increasing the minimum wage and, like you said, having the tip minimum wage indexed to at least 70% of the minimum wage. So lifting both of those wage floors are essential. Tight labor markets also produce more upward pressure and helps reduce that wage inequality. So we have to look at, there are a number, I can't go into all of them now, but there are a number of macroeconomic policies that have allowed America to become more unequal in terms of wages and earnings. You know, we've cut capital gains tax rates. We've had a lot of trade deals that have been very bad for U.S. workers, that have not really strengthened, not led to increased job creation. And, well, I'll just really just end there, but we have to think about really supporting a whole range of policies that lead to more job creation so that people can have jobs, and tight labor markets so that we can lift wages.
Wilhelmina? Yeah.
Thank you both, because Saru and Chuck sort of gave us a framework that I'm going to say a little bit about. What I'm going to talk about is some of the challenges that low-wage workers face in terms of getting benefits when they retire. Most low-wage workers don't have a 401k or a 403b or an IRA or even a pension. Therefore, most low-wage workers are very dependent on Social Security. And there are barriers that get in the way and keep low-wage workers either from accessing these benefits or from getting the full complement of these benefits. For instance, the farm worker and the low level of wages that they earn, were mentioned earlier, but one of the real challenges for the farm workers, and I'm sure many people in here know this, is that many of them are not classified as farm workers. They're classified as independent contractors, and therefore that means that their employers don't have to pay FICA taxes for them, and that if they want to be covered under the system, they have to file Schedule C as self-employed, pay the 12.4% tax on their earnings, and then wait to get 6.2% of that back. That doesn't work as a strategy. And the way I would solve that problem is to use one of the terms that Saru put on her slide about consequences for the low-road actors. I'd like to see some more regulatory or accounting burdens placed on farm worker employers to create some disincentive for them to label their farm workers as independent contractors, and an incentive for them to count them as they are, as employers, and to actually pay their FICA taxes. A similar situation exists for domestic workers because they have to earn more each quarter to be eligible to count that quarter toward their benefits when they're eligible. And a simple solution here would be to just equalize the earnings thresholds. I can't explain why they exist, but that's a very simple policy solution. When I heard what the wages were for workers in the restaurant industry, I realized that most workers clearly qualify, if they stay in that industry their whole career, they qualify as lifetime low-wage workers. And if you are if you are half of a couple, both of whom are lifetime low-wage workers throughout their careers, both of whom are getting very limited amounts in their Social Security checks when they draw them, and your spouse dies, what you're left with is about half of that very small amount to live on. You know, the spouse who is still living has about half of that to live on for the rest of their lives. What you can do about that is to change laws so that the surviving spouse is given at least a minimum of 75% of the sum of those two benefits. And I will just wave this document. It's a report that we issued last year by the Commission to Modernize Social Security. And it lists a number of steps that can be taken so that the retirement benefits for the low-wage workers, the people who only have Social Security benefits to fall back on, so that these benefits can become more adequate. They can live rather than, you know, just bide their time until they die. And this report also recommends ways to make the system more solvent. Now, having said all of these things, how do you get this to happen? Someone earlier today, and I forget who it was, made reference to the organization Caring Across Generations. And I think working with a group like that to sort of draw in the segment of our country who makes use of the domestic workers, the caregivers, to help support getting a better set of benefits for them. And I think also a way to go is, and I haven't heard this mentioned so far during this meeting, is there is a growing labor force that can only be called contingent. This labor force consists of young people, many of whom have a BA degree, some have more, but they're only able to get contract jobs. They're not able to get the regular full-time job with the benefits, the retirement plan, et cetera. And that's due in large part to the economic downturn. They're having real challenges, you know, making a way, breaking into the labor force. They're not necessarily going to wind up at the end of their careers being lifetime low-wage workers, but they are having challenges. The final point to say on that is that this is one group of people that you could tap into for support for a lot of the measures that would benefit not only the lifetime low-wage workers, the restaurant workers, the people who used to have unions but don't anymore. You know, you could tap into them as well in order to move this effort forward.
Thank you, Wilhelmina. Before Roy speaks, I'm going to pass the mic a couple more times, but I'm going to ask you to keep your remarks somewhat short so that we can get a few questions in. So, Roy.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'm going to stand up because I can think better on my feet than I can on my, never mind. I can think better on my feet, yeah. Okay, so one of the things that I got a kind of a mixed message today, I think, or tonight. One of the things that I want to do is leave a little bit of more positive feel for Social Security, give you some good news about Social Security, and kind of try to dispel a lot of the myths that we hear on TV every night, that we hear our politicos in Washington, D.C. talk about. So much of this stuff that we hear, all the rhetoric about Social Security running out of money, Social Security not going to be there for our children, all of that stuff is totally false. So I want to allay any fears that you might have that Social Security is not going to run out of money. It has right now about $2.6 trillion in its funds. That sum is projected to raise to about $4.3 trillion by the year 2023. Now, it is true that in about 30, depending on who you listen to, there's a lot of groups that give you different dates, but depending on who you listen to, those trillions will indeed run out by the year 2036, 2033, 2042, 2052, whatever there's different groups that say different things. So depending on what that magical year is, yeah, those funds will be gone. But that doesn't mean by any stretch that Social Security will go bankrupt, will go under, will run out of money. Why do I say that? Because there will still be about 171 million of us that work every day and pay into Social Security. So worst case scenario, let's say that magical year rolls around and we've done nothing about adjusting Social Security. It will still be able to pay around 80% of its obligations without any adjustments. Of course, we don't want 80%, we want 100%. So what do? In my studies, I've worked with Social Security issues for 42 years, so I kind of have kept up with what could happen if certain changes were made. So in my estimation, the best thing that could be done to solve our long-range challenges is to raise the cap. The cap today, in other words, the amount that you pay into Social Security, the amount of wages that you pay based on is $110,100. In other words, you've earned $110,100 and you stop paying FICA taxes. So a lot of the millionaires that are going way above that are only paying a small percentage of their income into Social Security, yet they reap better benefits than we do who have lower earnings. So the idea would be to lift that ceiling. A lot of people say, let's totally do away with the cap. That can be a diminishing return. So there's a magical number where you can lift it to. Okay, so anyway, I got to hurry through this thing. But I echo Wilhelmina's sentiments about the lower wage earner that has not had enough income to invest, to save, etc. That is some of the groups that I could talk about would be Latinos, Indians, Native Americans. They like to be called American Indians in New Mexico, so I've gotten used to that politically correct term. So pardon me if I say Indians, because that's what they like. So anyway, women, of course, there's the issues about caregiving. Usually when somebody gets sick at home, who is the one that leaves the job and comes home and takes care of daddy or little child or whoever? It's usually mama or grandma. And so there is also, I'll wave this little booklet here. It is called Breaking the Social Security Glass Ceiling, a proposal to modernize women's benefits. This is available to all of you. It is written by, compiled by the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, who I represent in Washington, D.C., the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and NOW. It was a joint venture, so if you can get a hold of this, that'll give you a lot of the proposals that we've been discussing about as far as what could be done to make Social Security more equitable to women. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roy. So in case you're wondering what was happening there, the issue is thinking about economic security over a lifetime. And I asked some of our Social Security experts to tie the issue of low-wage workers to Social Security. So looking at what will happen over a lifetime. So it's important to think about how to connect what seemingly is, it's not disconnected at all, two issues. Low-wage work and what can happen to them when they become older and have to rely on Social Security. So just in case people were wondering what the connection is, that's the connection. We're going to have Sandy. Sandy, we will tap you. You talk too long.
Okay.
And then we'll open it up for a few questions, and we'll wrap up.
So I'm just deeply impressed with the work that both Saru and Chuck are doing. And it displays a great deal of courage and imagination And I think that we require the same degree of courage and imagination in proposing policies for change that break with marginal tinkering with the system as it stands. And so one of the structural changes that I've been advocating for a while now in conjunction with Derek is the baby bonds proposal. But there's another structural change that I think would directly address a host of the problems that both of you are concerned about, which is the introduction of a federal job guarantee for all citizens. The provision of a minimum salary of $20,000 with approximately $10,000 in benefits. Those $10,000 in benefits would constitute medical insurance as well as a retirement plan for each worker who's in the public service employment sector. If we put 15 million people to work in the sector at $50,000 in total expenses per worker, this would cost us $750 billion per annum. It would be less than the amount of the initial stimulus package and considerably less than the amount of money that was turned over to the investment banking community at the start of the crisis. It would be a program that would be permanent and universal. It would provide a guarantee of full employment continuously throughout the economy. And it would provide that minimum wage floor de facto that would compel employers to make sure that they pay all workers at least the salary that they could obtain from the public service employment sector. This is a bolder proposal. It's the type of proposal I think we need to put on the table. And it breaks with the pattern of what Bachrach and Bartsch used to call non-decision making, which is ruling out particular options because you just don't believe that they could be feasible. But if in fact we do have this true ground change in the demographics of the American electorate, then a host of things ought to become possible that we have not considered feasible before.
Thank you, Sandy.